What do Logan Paul, J. Cole, and Aunt Becky all have in common?
They've all been canceled at one point or another.
Recently, we had an extended conversation with Cal Newport after the episode was recorded to talk about cancel culture.
Today, we're bringing you a snippet from that conversation that dives deep into the historical roots of cancel culture and the importance of pluralism.
We got pretty deep into the weeds in this conversation. We're going to be hopping in and out for a bit of commentary, but feel free to sit back, relax, and enjoy the combo.
Without further ado, let's hop into the first clip.
Something that's, I think, could be really useful to interrogate on your show is, it's complicated so people don't, and it's fish and water thing. If it's all you're exposed to, you don't notice anything different, but is the fundamental theoretical frameworks that are giving rise to things like cancel culture. So like kind of an issue right now is these issues happen and people sort of feel on either side of it. And it feels like it's like intuitive and emergent. It's like, I don't know, like people just feel it's some grassroots, like people just feel threatened by this and other people don't, or this or that.
One thing to add right here is that cancel culture, from my understanding, and I sort of agree with Cal on this one, is that it has some sort of intuitive aspect in terms of our psychology, the way in which we operate. In the wild, I don't know, when we were in prehistoric times, I'm sure that if somebody threatened us, we would attack, we would defend.
Yep.
But like I said before, we're not in prehistoric times. My name isn't Caveman 1. Your name isn't Caveman 2. And so we still have this pre-programmed system to defend, but we don't really have a need for it anymore. And now we have social media, we have phones in our hands, and that gives us an outlet to defend, and we use our ideas as a plate of armor.
Good point. Let's hop into the historical roots of all of this issue, because these ideas didn't just come out of nowhere.
Very clear intellectual trajectory. So these ideas all came out of academia, and you can actually, it's a very interesting intellectual trajectory. So it's the rise, there's different names for it, basically the rise of critical theory. And then out of critical theory, you get a lot of subshoots that are really, so essentially this stuff started rising in academia in the 80s and 90s. Okay. So what I mean, this is classical Marxism, which was really about the working class tensions, the oppressed of this, it had really hit the skids by like the 60s or 70s, in part because just a lot of reasons, but like the Soviet Union, Cambodia, like it wasn't going well. And it was just a lot of evidence that like Marx's understanding of how markets worked wasn't right. And it was sort of losing favor. And then the progressive minded academics, of which I count myself, were getting tired of defending the working class because they supported Vietnam. They seemed like they were kind of racist and they were on the wrong side of civil rights. And so there was this transformation that happened in academia starting in the 1980s. That said, let's shift from sort of these economic issues and more towards social issues. Like it's less about, we care a little bit less about the working class being oppressed, but more about, let's say, some identity groups being oppressed. Because like if you're Black in America, it's really pretty terrible, right? And so they had to build up some new theoretical frameworks to explain, when it came to economic oppression, Marx had laid out these really complicated theories about the way that, the exploitation of capital works. And he had this whole complicated theories. It's great for academics. Academics love theories. They had to start from scratch. So they borrowed a lot of ideas from French postmodern thinkers. You get Foucault, you get Derrida, you get Lacan. And they brought in their ideas, and then they mixed them with sort of more of this goal of whatever. And then it gets to the rise of critical theory. And then that in the 90s starts really spreading in academia, right? And it starts to take over departments. And then when you had the 2008 crisis was like a turning point where it added a the self-defensive rule, which was you're not allowed to critique this theory. Because this theory says if you critique the theory, it's because you're the thing that the theory says is bad, which is exactly what Marxism did in the 40s. They said, if you critique Marxism, it's because you're part of the bourgeois superstructure that's trying to keep the exploitations. And we mock that now. But if you were on a college campus in the 40s, it's what you would hear. You're like, of course you would say that. It's just you're part of the bourgeois superstructure trying to keep the exploitation of the working class. When it put that in place, it actually started. That's when you really started getting like people losing their jobs. Like it aggressively began to take over college campuses. It's the only thing you've been exposed to at Georgetown, probably. But it's important to know like that critical theory, 15 years ago, there was multiple theories competing to understand the world. It temporarily took over. And now it's kind of come out into the cultural sphere because people have graduated from these schools.
The thing is that it's acceptable to have multiple theories.
It should be, yeah.
And I think there's a key point that we need to understand, that theory doesn't mean fact. It's just a different way of understanding something. And when we look at it in this case, at least from a historical standpoint, looking at back at the bourgeoisie versus proletariat situation, it's a theory. It's not a fact. And of course, that was tens of years ago, but the same principle applies today. People may have differing understandings of different social, cultural, economic issues, but they're theories. It's okay to have dispute between theories, and anybody in science can tell you this. At least you're Mr. Research. I think you can attest to this.
Yeah.
Contrasting of theories only develops the theories further.
Yes.
It gets you to a better point so that you can be more grounded in reality.
Yeah. In the context of cancel culture, I think that's where it gets a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
Because the assumption is that you are always wrong. But humans are all fallible. The case that I think about when looking at cancel culture from a historical lens is the Salem witch trials.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been doing it for a long time.
Definitely.
But the question is, where do we go from here? Do we want to continue acting in a similar manner as we did during the Salem witch trials, or do we want to move into a different path that accepts that pluralism is okay?
The Salem witch trials is a bit different. I would say that 2020 America, in terms of cancel culture, is probably more corrosive than the Salem witch trials because the community's larger now. Twitter, congratulations, 1 million people just canceled you. What happened in Salem witch trials? Like, I don't know. There was a community. You can still, if you do something really bad, I mean, I'm sure that somebody's going to be at your house.
Okay, fair point.
You know what I mean?
It's an interesting theoretical framework. But it's the foundation of a lot of thinking going on right now. And it's got a lot of really great ideas, and it's got a lot of sort of worrisome ideas. But a lot of the things that you guys are worried about is a direct impact of this theoretical framework. So why is cancel culture a thing? Well, critical theory pulls really strongly from Derrida that it's really like words and images are essentially tools that are used to construct structures of power that are used for supremacy. Mm-hmm. And so in the confines of critical theory, stopping words is the same as in like nonviolence theory doing a protest march. Like it's seen as like if we can stop this person talking is actually like part of the structure, a structure made up of words and power dynamics that's made to put some sort of supremacy in place, is made to exploit or whatever. So like a lot of things that feels like intuitively like that doesn't make sense, critical theory has actual explanations for. I'm a sunlight person. I think it's good it could be really interesting. Like, what's the theoretical foundation of a lot of these ideas? Because I think right now, a lot of people in your generation think of them as just like this thing that emerged. Like you showed up at college, you didn't know you weren't exposed to theory. You go to college, you expose theory, you see the world. This happens to everyone at college at all times throughout all of the 20th century. You're exposed to whatever theory is popular at the moment. Your comparison is theory versus no theory. Like, oh, when I was home, I didn't see the world through fancy theories. My parents don't talk about fancy theories. I'm enlightened now. This must be right. Now, of course, these theories change every 15 or 20 years. There's huge attacks from the left on critical theory because it's bonkers in some ways and it's not very efficacious and doesn't actually do a great way of actually explaining how the world works. So I'm sorry, it's a long answer, but basically like what I'm implying is like if you actually, and not from like a antagonistic stance, but if you actually were like, we hear these terms and we hear these ideas, where did it come from?
Yeah.
Oh, like this person wrote this book. They were influenced by this person. Because when you put sunlight on these things, it's much easier to say like, you know what? I think that idea, that's really great. But I don't know, that idea is maybe not so great. And it's sort of the scariest thing to me about any theoretical framework is once they add that extra coda that says you're not allowed to question the framework. Mm-hmm. That's what made Marxism go off the rails. Mm-hmm. It had great insights about the exploitative nature of capitalism. But as soon as the Bolshevik Revolution said, oh, to question any aspect of this theory means that you are actually trying to undermine and exploit the working class. I mean, eventually that led to them shooting the people who were questioning the theory.
By adding that premise, it sort of begs the question, are they any better than any other theory?
Well, I think there are objectively better theories.
No, but by adding that premise of like contrasting or going against what we have to say means that you're bad.
Yeah.
Does that make them any better? I think it discredits whatever their great ideas were. And in this case, 100%.
To some extent, it feels almost like you can't defend your argument.
Yeah.
Like, that's a very easy stopgap to every conversation. Mm-hmm. It's just, my rule is superior, 100%. It is golden, no touching it. I don't know if there's a singular theory that can define the entire world. But that's where the cool part comes in, right? It's like, it's almost like a jigsaw puzzle or puzzle in general. You piece different things together, and they help us understand the world, much like Cal's doing for us right now.
That's what happens when you start doing that. Who's going to survive? Mm-hmm. Not the noblest Platonic philosopher kings. It's going to be the sort of most brutal guy on the block. It's going to be the Stalin. It's going to be the last guy standing once you start doing that. So anyways, it might be interesting. I don't think your generation hears a lot about sort of the intellectual origins of these ideas. I think Sunlight's great. The whole point about radical theory is that you're supposed to be avant-garde, and it should be about 40% crazy. Because what happens is you destabilize the way people think, and you advance human knowledge.
Some people are meant to be pokers.
Yeah, some gadflies.
Yeah, but you need that, right? Like, you need
100%.
If
America wouldn't have been
born.
Yeah, exactly. Without the guy Thomas Paine poking these other countries in the side.
That's where I think Cal would agree that cancel culture can be very productive.
100%. But there's a fine line, like what we talked about before, between productivity and redundancy and destructivity, if that's a word.
Destruction.
Destructivity. We're keeping this in too.
Yeah.
Love radical theory. Yeah. The problem is when you take radical theory and say, oh, this is a governing philosophy.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
And then it doesn't work. It's not meant to be. Foucault or Derrida, they didn't want, like, don't rule your country off of my theory.
Those are some big words and some big philosophers. I would not be super concerned with what they say. All I would say is they are those pokers. They are the people within philosophical chambers that are saying, hey, let me throw a ridiculously crazy idea out there and let's walk it back.
I'm trying to make like these other academics uncomfortable, and then we'll end up someplace better. But don't come in and say, oh, and we're going to now run our company, based off of they lose or something like that. Was never their goal. So that's always where it gets dangerous. Is like, well, these theories are supposed to be radical. That's what's great and intellectually stimulated about them. But they're also supposed to be challenged. And this is like Jonathan Haidt's thing, basically. His whole argument is like, if you have just one theory, terrible things happen. If you have two, great things happen. You just need one other theory. So once people can accept it, like you can just like, this might not be completely right. There could be flaws. Progress, it makes all the theory better. It advances everything. And so that's his whole heterodox university stance, which has multiple Georgetown members actually. Yeah. He has no particular stance on any particular issues other than there has to be in like almost every field at least 2 or 3 major theoretical frameworks. You cannot get to a place where only one is allowed, because once you do, it goes into a purity spiral and goes to weird places.
Yes. Cal. Yes. I don't know who the guy he mentioned was, but he seems like a smart dude.
Yeah, he accurately kind of explained how we've felt for a long time with these issues, right?
100%. Yeah, and it's weird because we're talking about this in the frame of philosophy. I'm not a philosopher. Asher's more into this stuff than me. 100,
I dabble.
100% dabble. This guy. Yeah, but anyway, so we're talking about it in terms of this grandiose sphere of philosophy and critical thought and all these fancy terms and words, but the application is ridiculous. Like we see it in our political sphere right now. That sense of purity or that single idea with no sort of contest. And that's why we see such cult followings behind Trump.
Or likewise on the other side,
yeah,
with a Sanders type. Mm-hmm. The lovely point that he makes here towards the end is about a purity test, I think, just to kind of highlight that a little bit. Purity tests are dangerous because no one can actually meet their own purity tests. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like with these philosophers, and we've talked about this before, what philosopher that we know actually lives by their own theory?
I think they're just creatives. Like, And also, a thing to note is that most philosophers, because of these theories, drive themselves insane. Like what he said is somewhat accurate, that 40% of the theory has to be sort of out there and ridiculous and pushing the buttons of modern culture's norms because it pushes the world forward, but at the expense of the philosopher's life a lot of times.
Yeah.
The echo chamber alone doesn't explain the phenomenon. It's the echo chamber plus this cognitive push towards othering. And that's like where I've evolved on it. Like I used to think it's just like, oh, you're not exposed. It's like you are exposed to other things because you go to war all the time if you're a heavy social media user. You always go to war against the opponent. It's this the othering impulse of like, as you make you feel, the more you can dunk, the more you feel, the more your tribe pulls you in. And there's sort of like this warlike nature that gives you meaning. There's a book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. Great book by a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist. Beautiful book, like kind of a meditation on it. But I think it's like really relevant for this time. So it's like breaking the echo chamber is not enough anymore because it's like, it's just great. Expose me to the enemy and let's go to war.
It's not bows and arrows and guns anymore. It's periods, commas, dashes, and other exclamation points and more capitalized letters and a whole slew of crazy words. And it's crazy to think that the power of our words has that much meaning in today's culture. And we seem to disregard that.
I want to open a dialogue between the two of us right now on echo chambers, because what Cal just said there is totally counterintuitive to what we have preached on this podcast.
Okay.
And it made me rethink a lot of what we're doing. Because it is true. Like, right on this podcast, we want to create a forum for depolarization through conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But people are faced with these ideas constantly throughout their lives. You have a racist uncle, you have a homophobic, aunt. Not to say that any of y'all actually have that,
This
but
is
just
an
as
example.
You're faced with it constantly. So it's not that even you're not facing these issues. It's not that you need even a forum for that, but maybe it is about how do you get the tools to have those conversations, right? And so to open the dialogue, what types of tools do you think are necessary when you're trying to open an echo chamber and go in and not necessarily fight these people, but have a dialogue?
I think tools are the second piece of the equation. The first and the most important piece is to understand that in terms of the allegory of the cave, you're not living in the real world. You have to recognize that there is a world outside of your own. And so if the people, for instance, I'm dating a little bit back to some philosophy right now, but the allegory in the cave basically is this portrayal of the world through shadows and reflections on the wall, and people think that that's a real world. They had no exposure to the real world. All they had was that one interpretation. But the situation would be very different, and the plot line would be very different in terms of that sort of allegory if they knew that there was an alternate universe called the greater world that they were unaware about.
Sounds like a good show, The Greater World.
Oh, yeah, it is a good show. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense.
You have to recognize that you're in a cave before you get out of it.
So you're in your chamber, right? Like, people don't always understand the words that you're using, just like in this conversation, we use a lot of specific words. Explaining them is important so we can get common ground.
Yeah.
Right? I think another part, at least personally, in terms of tools to use in these conversations that we've gained by talking to people from all spectrums of the aisle, humility comes first. Humility in the sense of we cannot assume that we are always correct. Even if there's a 1% chance that we're wrong, we ought to accept that and move forward through the world with humility, and then the next step, which is empathizing with those people.
Yep.
And it might not be easy. It might not be easy to, especially with these like horrible ideas, like I mentioned previously, in conversations about racism, which are constantly happening right now, in conversations about sex, gender, etc. But if you can approach it with love, and that's like the hardest part, right? Like, if we put ourselves in the position of someone who's being attacked for just who they are, Like, we haven't experienced it that much, have we?
I don't think so.
Sometimes I will say, though, that you have to walk away from conversations like that. Like, if it is physically affecting you, emotionally affecting you.
Yeah. Like, we live in a response culture, and until you dissociate from it and almost delay the response, will you actually get a better response or more thoughtful response, I guess you could say.
Thanks for tuning in to this digital exclusive featuring Cal Newport. If you liked anything that Cal was saying in this little clip scenario, you're going to love the full episode, which we're going to link in that I button up top, and it'll also be the first link in the description. We will see you very soon with another digital exclusive, and as always, we have episodes releasing on Saturdays. Until then, peace.
Peace.